Some kids feel everything more, and the science says that's not a flaw, it's a superpower. If you're the parent of a highly sensitive child, you know exactly what I mean when I talk about big feelings. Well, welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to completely reframe what those intense emotions actually mean. We'll be taking the absolutely fascinating developmental psychology of sensitivity and translating it into a practical, hopeful guide for your family.
Seriously, I want you to let that quote really sink in for a second. For decades, a lot of intense childhood reactions were viewed strictly through this lens of deficit or vulnerability, right? Like something needed to be fixed. But developmental psychology has experienced a massive paradigm shift recently. As you'll see in the data we're looking at today, the exact same biological wiring that causes those really intense struggles is also responsible for some of the most profound human strengths.
Which brings us to a super intriguing question. Is your child an orchid? Now, hold on to that thought, because we're going to unpack this beautiful biological metaphor in just a minute. It's the kind of concept that might completely change how you view your kid's behavior from here on out.
Section 1. The superpower of sensitivity.
Let's dive right in by figuring out what we actually mean when we call a child highly sensitive. Researchers like Dr. Arons and her colleagues define the underlying trait as sensory processing sensitivity, or SPS. Notice the combination of traits here. SPS isn't just about crying easily. It actually represents a nervous system that takes in and processes environmental stimuli so much deeper than average. And because their brains are doing all that heavy lifting, they have greater emotional reactivity, they're incredibly attuned to subtle cues, and yeah, they definitely get overstimulated way more easily. But check out that third point, heightened empathy. It's a total package deal.
And hey, if you ever feel like you're completely alone in raising a child with these wild, intense reactions, take a look at this data. This is from a major 2018 study by Dr. Michael Pluess, Francesca Leonetti, and their team. They looked at sensitivity across populations and found that a whopping 31% of children fall into the high sensitivity category. Another 40% have medium sensitivity, and 29% have low sensitivity. So this is a perfectly normal, widely distributed trait. Roughly a third of all kids are wired exactly like this. You are definitely not alone.
Section 2. Orchids, dandelions, and tulips.
Okay, so how does this build into that flower metaphor I teased earlier? Well, researchers categorize these kids into 3 distinct groups. First up, you have your dandelions. These are your low sensitivity kids. Just like the weed, they're incredibly hardy. They can literally grow through cracks in the sidewalk, they bounce back, and are pretty resilient regardless of their environment. Then you've got your tulips, making up the majority at 40%. They're a bit less fragile than orchids, but moderately sensitive to the climate compared to dandelions. And finally, the highly sensitive group, our orchids. Orchids are uniquely responsive to their environment. If you put an orchid in harsh, poor conditions, it'll wilt. But, and this is absolutely crucial, if an orchid is placed in a highly nurturing, supportive environment, it doesn't just barely survive. It blooms more spectacularly than any other flower out there.
Section 3. Why big feelings bring fear.
So, you might be wondering, if orchids have this incredible capacity to bloom, why does it so often look like sheer fear and overwhelm when they're young? It all comes back to how their central nervous system is built. Sensitive kids just notice more and they feel things much more intensely. Imagine having a volume dial on your senses and your emotions, and it is perpetually cranked up to 11.
Because they process literally everything so deeply, intense sensory input, like a loud siren, bright fluorescent lights, or just a chaotic playroom, completely floods their system, and that naturally leads to heightened emotional reactivity. When they're faced with novel or uncertain situations, their highly tuned threat detection system just starts blaring the alarm, which results in much stronger fear responses. So yeah, big feelings mean big fears. But, and please take away this one point today if nothing else, the exact same biological wiring that triggers those really intimidating fears is exactly what allows them to experience such deep empathy, profound joy, and really beautiful aesthetic appreciation.
Section 4. The hopeful science of flourishing.
This is where the researchers completely flipped the script on high sensitivity. 2 pioneering scientists, Belsky and Michael Pluess, formalized a framework called differential-susceptibility. It proves that highly sensitive children are simply more affected by their environments, for better and for worse. Meaning, they aren't just more vulnerable to the bad stuff, they are actually disproportionately receptive to the good stuff.
Just look at the stark contrast here. For the longest time, psychology relied on the diathesis stress model. That's really just a fancy academic way of saying some people have a biological vulnerability, and when stress hits them, they break. Period. But Belsky and Pluess's differential susceptibility model completely replaces that.
Sensitivity is not a defect. It's not a pure vulnerability. It is a biological responsivity dial.
So, the big aha moment is this. The exact same wiring that turns up fear, anxiety, and overwhelm in a harsh, unsupportive setting is the exact same dial that turns up flourishing, resilience, and pure brilliance in a supportive one. Because their dial is turned all the way up, orchid children are uniquely responsive to warmth and reassurance from you. The data shows they thrive brilliantly in secure, low-conflict environments. In fact, intervention studies show that highly sensitive kids actually benefit the most from positive psychological support, way more than dandelion kids do. When you really lean into predictability and calm, your orchid doesn't just do okay, they literally soar.
Section 5. How to raise an orchid.
Let's translate all this developmental psychology into a practical, everyday playbook for raising your orchid. Based on the research, here are the actionable steps you can start doing today. First, reframe sensitivity as a strength out loud. Tell them their deep feeling and empathy are amazing gifts. Second, manage the overstimulation. Because their brains are basically working overtime, they desperately need built-in downtime and quiet spaces to recover. Third, warn and prepare them. Giving them advance notice of changes prevents those internal alarm bells from ringing. Fourth, validate those big feelings first. Say something like, "Wow, that felt like a lot, I'm right here with you." And then gently pace their brave steps forward. And finally, invest in a warm, low-conflict environment. Remember, orchids absorb their environment deeply, so your warmth pays outsized dividends.
Now, on the flip side, it is so incredibly common for well-meaning parents to fall into a few specific traps. You really want to avoid labeling them as too sensitive or shaming those big feelings. Doing that just creates a harsh environment that they will instantly absorb. And whatever you do, please don't flood them with massive stimulation or overschedule them in some misguided attempt to toughen them up. Throwing an orchid into a harsh winter storm doesn't suddenly turn it into a dandelion. It just makes the orchid wilt.
I do want to provide a very honest, reassuring caveat here, though. Sensory processing sensitivity is a perfectly normal temperament trait. It's not a clinical diagnosis, and it is definitely not a disorder. However, if your child's fear or overwhelm reaches a point where it's actually impairing their daily life, consulting a professional is a fantastic, supportive step to take. Honestly, it's just another way of providing the high-quality environment your specific orchid needs to bloom.
To wrap things up, giving your highly sensitive child the right tools can make all the difference in turning their intense feelings into their absolute greatest asset. If you're looking for an incredible resource to help build that supportive, empowering environment we've been talking about, Fear Me Not helps kids conquer fears through science-backed play. It perfectly aligns with the strategy of pacing those brave steps in a really warm, engaging way. Thank you so much for joining me to explore the beautiful science behind the highly sensitive child. Remember, that deep sensitivity isn't something to fix. It's a spectacular bloom just waiting for the right light. So what is one warm, supportive change you can make today to help your orchid thrive?